Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to Heritage Voices, episode 29. I'm Jessica Yaquinto, and I'll be your host today. And today we're taking a journey to ancient Pawnee land with Roger Echo-Hawk.
Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge that the land that we are recording on today, which is in Longmont, Colorado, is Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute, Apache, Sioux, Comanche, Kiowa, Eastern Shoshone, and Pawnee traditional homelands.
Welcome, Heritage Voices, to the realms of the Pawnee, the ancient homeland of the Pawnee, and this has been a homeland for many different peoples over a long time period. But I think that the ancestors of the Pawnees dwelt in eastern Colorado, from southern Wyoming down to northern New Mexico over a very long time period, so welcome.
Thank you. Why don't we get started with talking a little bit about what got you into this field?
Well, I got involved in thinking about what I call ancient history quite a long time ago in the course of working with the Pawnee Nation, the Native American Rights Fund, on issues related to the ancestry of the Pawnee people. Long ago, when the Pawnees got involved in repatriation issues, I had been doing research on Pawnee history for a while, and the attorneys and the leaders of the Pawnee Nation, they came to me with some questions that they had about looking into who our ancestors are and what is the evidence that says that to help guide repatriation policy issues for the Pawnee Nation. And so I started looking into these issues. I had been doing research on Pawnee history for a while, and the way that I started was by looking at my own family history. When I looked at histories of the Pawnee people, I couldn't sense a very clear connection between Pawneeland of today and what I was reading about. And so I decided early on that I wanted to do several things. One is to just look generally at issues related to Pawnee history. But second, to try to explore and develop that link between Pawneeland today and the history of Pawneeland that I was reading about. So what I started off doing was interviewing my family elders, and so I talked to various elders. I did interviews on family history, asking questions, getting family stories and stuff like that. And so that got me into thinking quite a lot about oral history, oral tradition. What do these narratives mean? How does that connect us to the past? What sense can we make of that kind of material? But I didn't think much about archaeology for a while until we started looking into this issue of, well, what does Pawnee ancestry consist of? And so I decided right off the bat that I wanted to take a serious look at archaeology and at oral tradition, and to try to bring those things together and to see what kind of storytelling would emerge from comparing the various heritage narratives that we can gather from different kinds of information. So I'd already been looking quite a lot at historical documentation. And so now I turn to archaeological information, which I had a general idea about some of that information, but did not know much about it. And so that launched my thinking about, well, how do these things fit together? Do they fit together? What can we learn about this? Mm-hmm. So that's basically where I started from back in the late 1980s.
Mm-hmm. And at that point, did you feel like they did fit together well? I mean, what you were hearing from your family, how did that go with the dominant history and archaeology of the time?
Almost immediately, I started seeing what I thought would be arguable connections between the oral traditions that I was looking through and the archaeological record. And so I felt right off the bat that, well, there's something to explore here, but exactly where this will go, I wasn't sure. But after looking into things for a few months, for a while, I decided that one could divide the oral traditions into various classes. One class is a group of traditions that you can argue are fairly recent in time. In other words, they mention things like horses, guns, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so looking at these stories and evaluating, well, these look more recent in time. That was one class of traditional information.
Okay.
A second class, I thought, could be attached to the archaeological record going back for some period in time. And as I looked into this, I thought, well, there's a group of, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 different accounts that I thought fit with the archaeology record going back to what's called the Central Plains tradition, so maybe 800 years ago or so. Mm-hmm. And I thought there was an arguable fit of some of that material to the archaeology. Mm-hmm. And then there's an even earlier class of accounts of stories of insights that I thought related to even earlier periods.
Mm-hmm. And what was the response to, because I imagine that did you publish on this? What was the general response to that perspective?
Well, I think in academic terms, there is a long history of looking at oral information. And as I've given thought to how my work was initially received, I think we can divide that into two categories. One is an academic response to the heritage of thinking about oral documents, oral literature, and there's a long tradition of looking at that. Now, in oral traditional studies in general, I think we can say that early on there was a lot of thinking about historicity and oral records going back a great distance in time. And so we find in folklore studies in Europe and the United States, for example, that there is an effort to try to piece together things. Mm-hmm. And as history and archaeology professionalized during the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a rethinking of that legacy of work, a vast body of work by the American Folklore Society, the British Folklore Society, looking at materials in a global sense and trying to evaluate, well, what kind of sense do we make of this? For example, in Britain, there was quite a lot of thinking about ancient history and folk stories, fairy tales, and that kind of material. Basically, oral literatures of various kinds, and looking at historicity there and coming up with models that plug those things in together. But as the academy professionalized, then those models of the past using oral information came under scrutiny, and a lot of that thinking got set aside, and then the folklore community moved on after World War I to thinking about issues like comparisons of texts and looking at texts as bodies of information that have traveled through time. What does that mean? But setting aside the mission to look at ancient history and deferring to what archaeologists were doing and historians looking at various kinds of records. And so we see that process unfolding, and there's a long stretch of time in which there isn't very much done at all on oral traditional information. And so when I got into looking at this information, there had been a very substantial gap in time. From those early days up through, I don't know, maybe the 70s of, there's not much work done now. That was kept alive by the work of various scholars. One, for example, is Jan van Sina. He did some very interesting work looking at oral traditionist history back in, I think, the 60s, 70s, and issued various editions of a book called Oral Traditionist History. I think that's the name of it. But he sort of kept alive the idea that there's material to look at. There are analytical procedures that can be employed to look for ancient history. But there just, for a long period of time, there wasn't much interest on the part of academic scholarship. Now, in Indian country, there's another process that's unfolding at the same time, and that is racial Indians are not immune or divorced from the larger processes of thinking in the academy and in the culture at large. And then I think in Indian country there's been a diversity of thinking that grew up, in terms of pondering the ancient past, looking at oral traditional information. But in a lot of cases, there just wasn't much of a sustained project to set down a literature of thinking about these issues. And instead, I think there came to be a kind of a difference. Well, what do academic scholars say? How does that contrast? And I think there grew up kind of a skepticism toward the academic project in terms of thinking about antiquity. And so when I came on the scene, other issues, political issues, came into play that were also shaping this geography, this intellectual geography. And so my work, I think, in the academic world, there just wasn't a very established framework for absorbing new thinking about oral traditions. There just wasn't any real foundation to build on there. It was gone by that time, pretty much. And so, for example, when I got into my graduate program, I decided I would look at origin stories worldwide and examine that material for connections to the historical past. And so I talked the history department at the University of Colorado into going along with me on this, and they were very open to doing this. They hired a new professor at the time who they thought might be compatible with the kind of thinking that I was trying to pursue. And all this really grew out of my work in repatriation and thinking about, well, what can we say about the ancient past, about our ancestry and oral information, the archaeological record, things of that nature. And And so I continued that thinking, that research in my master's program at the University of Colorado. And they hired Vine Deloria to become a professor there, and he took me on as one of his early grad students there. And he was very reluctant when he saw what I was doing. He proved to be a real problem in terms of thinking about archaeology and oral tradition. He was very reluctant for me to look at archaeological information, and there was no established programmatic process either in Indian country or in the academy for me to be doing what I was doing. And I knew already by that time that racial Indians were not very they were resistant to the idea that archaeology could serve as a useful window into the ancient past, and instead racial Indians needed to challenge archaeology on various issues and confront archaeologists. And so Vine, he would tell me, for example, you can't do this archaeology because we need to confront those guys, not affirm what they're doing. And I said, well, I think that there's a lot of common ground and we need to develop that. And so ultimately, he decided he could not be the chair of my thesis project, and he had to back out because he just did not agree with what I was doing. And so I got a lot of academic resistance from that area, from Vine Deloria about all this. And so I went right on ahead and did what I thought I should be doing. And I continued with that research, and he dropped out, and then I completed my master's and did my thesis and everything. But then the university told me that they could not support a PhD program for me. I'm not sure why, but Vine had dropped out, and I don't know what happened, but there was no support for me to continue in a PhD program there. So I went on to do other things, and at the same time period, I'm starting to work with a few archaeologists in the Central Plains on various projects, and finding that there's curiosity about what I'm doing. But, again, there's no real programmatic way to relate what I'm doing to what they're doing.
So we are actually already at our first stopping point. So we will be right back in a moment.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code HEVO, HEVO.
Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
All right, and we are back. When we left off, you were talking about not pursuing a PhD because the university. So, and then you also mentioned the politics of the time and repatriation. So what was your next move after getting your master's?
Well, one thing that I think was pretty clear to me at the time is that there wasn't really much infrastructure in terms of involvement of archaeology in Indian country. And so, for example, there had never been, up to the early 1990s, any archaeologists who came to Pawneeland to talk about their research. And there had never been a Pawnee student of archaeology who had done the academic coursework and had worked with archaeologists. And there was no heritage program in Pawneeland that had to do with archaeology. And so I didn't really know how to address that myself, because I don't consider myself to be an archaeologist. It's just a body of information that I felt needed to be explored and deserved to be taken in hand as an insight into antiquity and what Pawnee history consists of. The ancient roots of Pawneeland needed to be looked at through an archaeological lens, but we also needed to have this other component. And so I think this is a common story nationally. During the early 1990s, if I'm correct about this, I think there were only a couple of racial Indians who identified that way, who were involved in archaeology. And so this is why people like Vine Deloria and his colleagues could, treat archaeologists as the enemy, because they were not necessarily taking on archaeologists in Indian country who were racial Indians who identified as Indians and also did archaeology. There just wasn't much of that around at all. When Vine opposed what I did, he was not really opposing Indians, but was rather instead, I think, putting his finger on the pulse of Indian country and trying to articulate some of the concerns that he thought racial Indians ought to have about archaeology. And so I come along and I say, we need to take this body of information seriously and treat it with respect and try to develop a mutual regard where we can hope to compare our narratives about the past and do all of that. And I was pretty much alone in saying that. In other words, archaeologists didn't know what to make of me, and Indians didn't like hearing that.
No.
And so I just thought, well, I think what I'm saying I feel pretty good about, and I need to continue doing this on my own. And so at that point in time, there was a lot of development that needed to happen. But fortunately, I think there came to be a few people. Joe Watkins is one of the leading figures in the development of what's called Indigenous archaeology.
Right.
And Joe and others decided that they would try to bring together the few threads out there that could be used to weave together a new approach to thinking about these things. And I think nowadays it's so common to see heritage programs and Indian country archaeology programs and students of archaeology. I think to myself, I wonder what Vine Deloria would make of this, and I don't know the answer to that, obviously.
Right.
I think I have the impression that the intellectual, academic culture makers of racial Indianhood would find things that they don't like about all these developments in Indian country regarding archaeology, but would also find things that they approve of as well. And so I just suspect that the resistance that I thought I saw, and that came my way, I'm not sure that resistance has changed at all. I think it's still there, very much so. But I think there's also been this curiosity, well, what are archaeologists saying? What kind of interest do we have when we hear about that?
Right.
And so I think there's been a lot to build on. And right now, I mean, I hear this term, Indigenous archaeology, all the time. I don't know what it means, but I think it means a lot of things, and I think it deserves to mean that. And Jessica, you spend a lot of time talking to Indigenous archaeology practitioners, and I'm not one of them, but
well, neither am I.
I'm very interested, and I have a lot to learn about that. So does this seem like a pretty fair characterization to you?
Yeah, I think it's changing a lot, is what it seems like. I mean, the people that I'm hearing from, definitely, like Carlton, who's sitting right here next to us, it seems like there's still a resistance from a lot of tribes, some tribes more than other. Like, it seems like, for example, a lot of the Dene archaeologists, that's one that comes right to mind, that they have a particularly hard time because the community very much has a feeling that archaeology should be left alone. And so to become an archaeologist is not something that's necessarily culturally super well seen. But at the same time, I do feel like after interviewing a good number of Indigenous archaeologists, they are also experiencing more of a feeling of acceptance than it sounded like you experienced. So basically that it is changing, but maybe slowly. Yeah. Carlton agrees. I'm curious to hear more about how all of this transitioned into your repatriation work that you then went into.
Well, I've been working with the team that crafted the National Museum of the American Indian Act and its successor, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, along with several state initiatives that helped to shape the intellectual foundations of the repatriation community today. When I ceased my academic studies, I took a job doing repatriation work for a couple of museums in the Denver area and spent some years implementing the federal regulations and the laws surrounding repatriation and trying to implement the provisions of those laws and work with museums and with racial Indian sovereignties nationwide. And so I did spend some years working on that, but I also continued my own thinking about things, and I tried in various ways to bring together these intellectual frameworks of looking seriously at oral tradition and looking at the archaeological record and thinking about what I call ancient history. I don't think that term is taken off at all because there does not seem to be, even today, any kind of widespread, infrastructure that looks at these issues seriously. There are no annual conferences on the ancient American history. There's not even any kind of language to discuss. When I say ancient history, people, I think in academia, sort of think I might be talking about Greece, Roman Greece, and your ancient Europe.
Right.
And so I think that there's a lot of room for growth in terms of thinking about these issues and developing academic projects to do that. And where I see this likely to happen first is in existing academic projects like the Society for American Archaeology, the Plains Conference, and things like that. So basically, archaeology organizations at their annual conferences and in their publications and their gatherings, starting to look seriously at oral traditional information, and now this can be used as a way to develop a sense of mutual exploration of antiquity of the past. past and bringing together and comparing notes and encouraging that. So I think that even though that has happened in various ways on a smaller scale here and there, I think there's a lot of potential for that really growing into something meaningful. And so I would hope that whatever Indigenous archaeology consists of today, that at some point we'll begin to see a growth of a real literature, of real projects in which people are comparing notes. I mean, I do what I do in Pawneeland, in the plains and all that stuff. But what I do needs to be compared in a larger regional sense to other communities that are adjacent, that are nearby. What are their traditions? How does that compare to the archaeology of their ancestry? And that expanding realm of connections needs to go out ultimately to cover the globe. So what is Indigenous archaeology? I think that's an interesting question. And right now, the way that it gets defined is in very racial definitions, very racial terms. And so I don't do race myself. I don't go along with the idea that we need to do race, that we have to have racial identities. And so I try not to embrace this tradition of thinking about racial identity as essential to our human identities. And I think this is well established in anthropology circles that there needs to be some kind of rethinking of racial systems, of definitions about race. And I don't see that rethinking happening in Indian country at all. Instead, there is a continuing project to institutionalize the programs of racial Indianhood. And I think that translates.
Talking about like blood quantum, for example, or?
Well, that's just part of it. But the very idea of Indigenous archaeology is very much tied to racial definitions of the term Indigenous there. And so I disagree with that. I think that there should be a broader program of rethinking of what race is and how it should function in the world. And I think that goes on in anthropology, but it doesn't go on in Indigenous archaeology or in the circles of racial Indianhood. And instead, I think the project of race is guiding things in Indian country and guiding things in Pawneeland and guiding things in Indigenous archaeology. And I think that there needs to be an expanded discussion about that whole project. And I would like to see that, but it's not happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot there to think about. For example, and we're about to break here in a minute, so, but I guess just some things for people to think about while we're on break is, you know, the concept of nationhood versus race. And also, you know, I'd be interesting to hear your thoughts after the break about, for example, how race, I mean, you're talking about, for example, that it's a concept that you don't necessarily feel like serves Indian country, and how do you balance that with the consequences that people experience? You know, like even if people don't self-identify as a race, that the consequences from the larger country or world, I guess, identifying people with that race. On that thought, we will take a break and be right back.
Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
At your job, do you ever have to deal with a nose roller? How about a snub pulley? Well, if you're installing a new conveyor belt system, dealing with the different components can sound like you're speaking a foreign language. Luckily, you've got a team ready to help. Grainger's technical product specialists are fluent in maintenance, repair, and operations. So whenever you want to talk shop, just reach out. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
And we are back. So we were just starting to talk a little bit about race right before the break. Talked a little bit about, the concept of race versus sovereign nations, and then also about how race is experienced versus identified, I guess would be the best way of putting it. So could you elaborate a little bit more on your thoughts about all of this?
Well, racial Indianhood is an enormously complicated identity project in the world, and it deserves careful rethinking, in my view. And so I tried to get practitioners of Indigenous archaeology to engage in that project for a time. But I think people involved in Indigenous archaeology are all caught up in, the things that interest them, rightly so, and developing, a lot of different threads of inquiry and projects around archaeology and implementation of NAGPRA. And issues like that. So there's a lot of things that need to happen. And I think this is one of those areas that I think is only it's a matter of time kind of thing, where this will be on the agenda at some point along the way. And I think the way that it should enter into the agenda is to have an expanded discussion of what race is in the world, and what its present status is, and what its past history is, and where to look in the future. And I think one way to look into the future about this is to look into the past, and that is that racial identity came to Pawneeland. It was not invented in Pawneeland.
Right.
Being a Pawnee Indian sounds very much indigenous. It sounds timeless. It sounds like it's been here forever. And so I think part of this project involves what is the history of race. And so I've spent some years trying to figure out for myself what is the history of racial identity in Pawneeland and elsewhere in the world. And so I've looked at the intellectual history of race and given a lot of thought about that. And here's one thing that I think deserves to be said and repeated in the halls of Indigenous archaeology, and that is that the people that we're studying in antiquity were not racial. They did not have racial identities. This is a new thing. And so before there were Pawnee Indians, there were Pawnees. And so part of the project of rethinking race, I think one thing that should happen is there should be room in the world for people like me. There isn't really much room for people like me in Indian country right now, and that is people who don't embrace race, want to engage in its practices, want to perform the acts of racial bonding that are so essential to Indian country nowadays. And I think instead there needs to be a non-racial identity option that is, respectable. And what I'm really saying here is that we need responsible options that are available to us, the kind of options that I think we can look into the past to see what are the identity systems that were current in Pawneeland 300 years ago, 1,000 years ago. And, we may not know the answers to those questions very well, but I think it is perfectly obvious that when we insert race into the past and we say that Native Americans settled in North America and Native Americans built Cahokia, then we're rewriting the past to make it racial. And I think that's one project that we need to take on right away. And this is a project in archaeology. I don't know how many archaeologists I see in my Facebook feed every day who are talking about Indians in antiquity, Indians who were not there. To me, this is like talking about, we're talking about ancient Democrats, ancient Republicans. And these are identity systems. They are cultural practices that are recent in time. And I don't think we rewrite the past to insert ancient Democrats. And I don't think we should rewrite the past to include ancient Indians, Paleo-Indians, Native Americans, whatever you want to call them.
Right.
If those terms are being emptied of meaning and filled up with the meanings of race, then I think that is a project that needs to be, thought about carefully and dealt with. I'm not saying that we need to dismiss and disrespect one another because we have different approaches. I don't have any interest in being French, adopting a French identity, becoming a citizen of France. But because I don't have an interest, that doesn't mean I hate the French.
Right.
So I don't do racial indigenhood. I don't regard myself as indigenous. I don't use those identity systems for myself. But I think we need to have what I think of as diversity, and that is a sense of mutual respect for people who do things differently. We should compare notes. We should talk.
Right.
We should say where we disagree and where we learn from each other. And so one thing that I try to do for myself, rather than advocating that other people do what I do, I want to listen carefully to what other people do that differs from what I do. And I think when it comes to racial practice, that's one thing that I can do. I can't change people's minds. I can't convince people that they should, take on these projects. I think these projects will happen. They will happen in time. That's, I don't have any doubt about that. But we can control what we do ourselves. And I think for this kind of a project, we need to start from a place of mutual respect.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it, especially thinking about archaeology. So obviously, the ancient people, they didn't look at themselves as a racial category, but they also didn't look at themselves as, a basket maker or Mississippian or, these other archaeology titles that we give them. So is there a better way of talking about people in the past?
Well, I think this is a question of ancient history. And that is, what can we say about identity systems in the past, and whether we can say a little bit or a lot. I think that the taxonomic program in archaeology, coming up with names like, Central Plains tradition, woodland tradition, and so forth, coming up with all those taxonomic systems, that has been very helpful, but that should not be the end point in terms of looking at the past and trying to characterize what, went on in people's lives and what they thought of themselves. And so in Pawneeland, for example, I think looking at the traditions about the ancient past, and here I want to acknowledge the work of Pawnee, who lived long ago. And his name was James R. Murray. Murray worked with a bunch of anthropologists in his day, between about, 1898 to his death in 1920. To help set down a vast literature that characterized Pawnee traditional information and cultural practice, religious activities, ceremonies, and so forth. That has been enormously valuable to me in trying to, piece together, well, what does traditional information look like? And so a lot of what I do is I sift through that information very carefully and try to evaluate from it. So what we're really getting is, this is what a traditional history looks like at circa 1900. And so this is looking back on the past from that viewpoint. It would be great to have a comparable body of information from circa 1806, when Zebulon Pike came to Pawneeland and set down a memoir of his visit there. if only he had ethnographers with him and who spoke Pawnee and set down a record of working with the Pawnees and talking to them at that point in time.
Right.
What information would we have that we could use in a comparative sense? And so we don't have much in the way of information like that at hand. But nevertheless, we have what we have, and I think it's very useful. So one thing I think we can say about the antiquity of Pawneeland is that we can ask ourselves, what is Pawnee identity? And I think this is a hard question to answer.
Right.
And in one sense, it's easy to answer. You're a Pawnee if you're a citizen of the Pawnee Nation.
Right.
That's an easy answer.
Right.
But it's harder to answer, well, what is a Pawnee identity?
Right.
And what does it look like in a chronological sense? So is Pawnee identity today the same as it was in 1900? The same as it was in 1800?
Right.
The same as it was in 1200 of the Common Era? Well, I think that the answer clearly is no, it isn't. And so that's why it's important, I think, to give thought about what racial identity does in Pawneeland and elsewhere. It has introduced an identity system that wasn't there before, so we can see this process. We can trace what happened. Well, if this process happened in a way that we can scrutinize very closely, this is a typical kind of process that we can look at in history. And so this ought to be a project in what I think of as ancient American history, and looking at identity systems as best as we can and trying to frame what they look like. And so one argument that I would make is that we can look at traditional information and we can see several emergent identity systems that are taking shape, I think, maybe about 800 years ago.
Okay.
They're not exactly Pawnee, and they don't really correspond very well with the systems that we can name today. But one of those has to do with the rise of what I think of as a Skeety Pawnee identity system. And this is a group of communities that came together to establish a federation, I think sometime around 1300 of the Common Era. And so around that time period, a group of communities are working together to establish a new ceremonial system that brings together their ceremonial practices into a common setting, a shared setting, a federation, a religious federation. And to me, that says here are the roots of a Skeety identity system in Pawneeland. I don't know if that term was used or if, or what kind of terminology we can use, but that, at worst we can say this is ancestral to what we think of as a Skeety identity. And elsewhere, there's another vast division in Pawneeland of another group of Pawnees that are rooted in a group, as I understand it, the Kawaraka's Pawnees. And this group gave rise to the other bands of Pawnees in more recent times. Well, recent, I don't know how recent it is, but these groups, I think, have roots in the same time period.
Okay.
And so I think we can see the emergence of a couple of identity systems, the Skeety and the Kawarakas, about 800 years ago or so.
Okay.
700, 800, 900 years ago. And so I think we can see that process happening when we look at oral traditions and when we look at the archaeology record. We need both of those.
Right.
Those things together help to open windows on the past that help us get a grasp on things. Now, here's why this is important overall, in my opinion. The whole academic inquiry project is all about studying what happened so we can understand ourselves better today. And the more that we know about the ancient past and history in general, the more ways we have of being ourselves today. And the more insights we have into the past that will take us into the future.
Right.
And so that is the justification for doing history, in my opinion. It isn't to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. I think that is a kind of a shallow saying that people often, deploy to talk about the justification of history. In my mind, the more we know about the past, the more we know about ourselves in the present. And I think that is a very important project. And so here is, I think, a vast point of order that I would say should guide us into the future. And that is, I can't study Pawneeland without thinking about an ever-expanding circle of other identity systems that interlock, that overlap, that feed into each other. The Pawnees do not move through time along a monolithic path. And instead, what we have is a continuing set of processes of people who come together, who diverge. And so we can look at those processes and we can say the Pawnees are not separate from humankind. We're basically all in this together. And so when I talk about Pawnee history, I've got to understand a lot of other kinds of history too.
Right.
And so what I'm really saying is, if being an American, I should feel some kind of heritage that goes back to Greece and Rome, then Jessica, you too, should also feel an investment in Pawnee history. That's part of your history too.
Right.
In other words, we all share this thing that we characterize in various ways.
Right.
Now, I'm not sure that it should mean the same for all of us. And so that's an important question that each one of us must settle for ourselves as we journey along through life. And that is, what do we make of the past? Who are we in the present as a result of that past? What can we learn about ourselves? And what do we hand down to our children?
Okay, well, we are right at the end of time. I could ask you a lot more questions, but in the last 2 minutes that we have, is there anything that you want to say or that you want people to know that you haven't already talked about?
Well, I'm so glad to have this opportunity to share my thoughts with Heritage Voices and all the people that are going to visit your podcast and give thought to what Indigenous archaeology is, what heritage issues are.
Right.
What is history? What is archaeology? What are we doing when we, plan together our projects of, enacting our humanity? And so I think that we have just spent an hour or so together, and that may be a long time for a lot of people to sit down and listen to. But so many of these kinds of interviews, they contribute dimensions that maybe we haven't thought about very much. I look at your other podcasts and I think, oh man, I wish I had like 3 lifetimes so I could listen to everything.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for inviting me to have a voice here. That's important to me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for coming on.
All right. Before we finish out today, I just wanted to add 2 quick things. First, if you enjoyed today's conversation and you are interested in learning more, please check out the show notes. There's lots of links to Roger's books and articles and things like that, including his newest book on ancient Pawnee history, which is The Enchanted Mirror, Ancient Pawneeland. And that you can get off of Amazon, and there's a link in the show notes. And also, I wanted to mention that Carlton Gover, who was in episode 27 of Heritage Voices, and who also made a brief cameo on today's podcast since he introduced Roger and I and got this conversation happening, that his new podcast, A Life in Ruins, is now available on the Archaeology Podcast Network. So if you go to www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/ruins, you will find A Life in Ruins. So if you liked that episode and wanted to get more of Carlton, here's your chance. All right, so thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Heritage Voices podcast. You can find show notes at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/heritage voices. Please subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or the Google Play Music Store. Also, if you like the show, please share it with your friends or write us a review. If you have any questions, comments, or show suggestions, please reach out to me at jessica@livingheritageanthropology.org, or you can find me on Facebook through Living Heritage Anthropology or on Twitter @LivingHeritageA. As always, thank you to my co-hosts Lyle.Balenquah and Jason Nez for their collaboration on our incredible logo.
This show is produced by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in Reno, Nevada at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.
Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.